Flooding in Charleston is nothing new. On the left here, we have a historic map of Charleston in 1850, 1849, and you can see where the naturally occurring tidal areas are compared to the image on the right-hand side, which is where we've built out, and you see that the areas that flood were once marsh. So we've, quote unquote, reclaimed that land from the Atlantic Ocean, and now that land is sinking. On top of that, you see the sea level rise trend going up and up and up. So as the peninsula's land is sinking, sea level is rising. When we have precipitation, there's nowhere for that water to go. So it's really a difference between whether you're going to wear boots or stilts. So what do we know about king tides? We know that even NOAA's best astronomical predictions were exceeding flooding levels both in terms of frequency and the duration of flooding events. Not all areas are going to be affected differently or are going to be affected equally because we have different topography, we have different infrastructures serving different areas. So this has social, environmental, and economic impacts to different communities. So we know it's going to increase, so what can we do here? So the easiest thing is to reduce the amount of pervious surface in our communities, in our own yards. Planting vegetation, providing areas for water to naturally percolate back down into the soil is a great start. The Dutch have taken nothing new, 21% of their population lives below sea level. So they have dikes and levees, and now in the recent decade, they've actually put in massive infrastructure projects to block sea level and storm surge from coming in and providing alternative pathways for floodwaters to go. They're actively relocating vulnerable populations to higher ground, but only 50% of their country is more than a meter above sea level. In Singapore, they've reduced channelized rivers and canals and reverted it back to a more natural state that provides natural flood control. This is a public park that is now serving as a tremendous amenity. In Copenhagen, they're trying something particularly novel. Have you ever noticed when you're driving down the road, the point of the road is in the middle? Well, they've inverted that. Their streets are becoming V-shaped, where the water moves into the center and drains, keeping the water away from the buildings and from where people live. As we're moving forward in the Charleston region, we need to begin to think creatively about how do we live with water? How do we accommodate it? We're not necessarily going to be able to erect seawalls and just keep the ocean and keep the rivers at bay. We need to learn how green infrastructure, living shorelines, rain gardens, and just preservation of natural areas can work hand in hand with infrastructure. We need to identify the areas that are most vulnerable and work with those communities on really thoughtful interventions that are not just going to work for the near term, but the midterm and the long term. I think we can all agree that Charleston has changed remarkably. Charleston is not the same city it was 50 or 100 years ago, and it's not going to be the same city 50 or 100 years from now. So the more that we can work across governmental boundaries, across organizational boundaries, engaging with community organizations and the interfaith community to not only understand the issues, and understand all the data that comes out of folks like Doug Marcy's group at NOAA and other organizations that have a really good handle on the environmental risk, but how do we then come up with solutions? So here in Charleston, we're working through a great public-private sector coalition called the Charleston Resilience Network, and we're working to reduce the barriers to quality information that can be used by private organizations, communities, governments to understand the environmental risks that we're dealing with and to come up with solutions that are going to work. This region is undergoing a tremendous amount of pressure in terms of development, tourists, increase of population, and diversifying economy, but we all have to be aware of the very environment that is drawing all of the interest, all of those people here. So the more we can work across governmental boundaries and organizational boundaries, align strategies, share information, the better off this entire region is going to be for our children and our grandchildren and future generations. So thank you very much for being here. Your participation in events like this is a critical step in that process. So thank you.